Radio programmers, network executives, and government bodies spent a lot of energy in the 1970s and 80s deciding what the public should and shouldn't hear. Some of the decisions they made are still surprising today. Here are the 10 most secret banned songs from the 70s and 80s only Gen X knows. Number 10, God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen in May 1977, timed to coincide with Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee celebrations, and the BBC banned it immediately and without qualification. Radio 1 would not play it. No BBC television program would feature it. Independent local radio stations across the United Kingdom followed suit under pressure from the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the regulatory body overseeing commercial broadcasting at the time. The ban was enforced so completely that the song reportedly reached the top of the UK singles chart while never once being broadcast on mainstream British radio during that chart run.
God save the Queen! She ain't no human being.
The chart position itself became one of the most disputed events in British pop history. The official chart compiler at the time, the British Market Research Bureau, listed Rod Stewart's I Don't Want to Talk About It at number 1 during the week that independent observers, record shop owners, and Virgin Records itself believed the Sex Pistols single had outsold every other record in the country. Many music industry figures from that period, and music historians who have examined the data in the decades since, have argued that the chart was deliberately manipulated to ensure that a song with the Queen's face distorted by a safety pin through the nose would not be seen, topping the British chart during a week of national celebration and royal pageantry. Virgin Records, which had signed the band specifically to release this single after EMI dropped them under corporate and establishment pressure, was openly and publicly furious about the chart outcome at the time. Whether or not the official ranking was adjusted, the BBC ban was real, rigorously enforced, and widely understood by listeners as a form of state-adjacent censorship rather than an ordinary editorial decision. In a country where BBC Radio 1 controlled the airwaves and determined what the majority of the listening public heard on a daily basis, removing a record from broadcast was the most powerful suppression mechanism available, and it was deployed against the Sex Pistols with no hesitation and considerable institutional coordination. Number 9, Physical by Olivia Newton-John. Olivia Newton-John released Physical in 1981, and it spent 10 consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making it the longest-running number 1 single of the entire decade in the United States. It was also banned by a significant number of American radio stations during this period, particularly across the South and the Midwest. The song's lyrics, while never explicit in any technical sense, were understood by virtually everyone who heard them to be describing sexual activity rather than exercise, and conservative programmers at stations and markets with religiously observant audiences decided they would not broadcast the record. Radio stations in Utah took particularly coordinated action to remove it from rotation entirely. Newton-John had built her public image across the 1970s on warm, approachable, family-friendly material. She had won 4 Grammy Awards, reached enormous commercial audiences with songs like I Honestly Love You and Have You Never Been Mellow, and maintained a reputation for a kind of wholesome brightness that was central to how the public perceived her. The response to Physical genuinely surprised a portion of her existing audience, even while it attracted a new one that had not previously paid much attention to her work. The BBC in the United Kingdom took no formal action against the record. The American bans at individual stations were uncoordinated and ultimately made no measurable commercial difference. The stations that continued playing the song reached audiences large enough to push the record to chart history regardless of the holdouts. The accompanying music video, in which Newton-John appeared at a gym surrounded by men who progressively removed their workout clothing, while she remained fully dressed, added another layer to a controversy that had already generated substantial complaint letters to station managers across the country. The irony of a song about sexual pursuit being banned while its creator's image of physical fitness was being promoted as aspirational was not lost on music journalists at the time. Number 8, Lola by The Kinks. The Kinks released Lola in 1970, and the BBC banned it, not because of its content, which described a male narrator developing feelings for a transgender woman in a London nightclub, but because of a mention of Coca-Cola in the original lyric. BBC policy at the time strictly prohibited the naming of commercial brands on its stations, treating any such mention as covert advertising, incompatible with the corporation's charter obligations. Ray Davies was informed of the specific problem by the BBC's standards department and reportedly flew from New York, where the band was in the middle of an American tour, back to London, specifically to re-record the offending lyric. He replaced Coca-Cola with the phrase "cherry cola," which satisfied the policy requirements, and the revised version was cleared for BBC broadcast without further objection. The original pressing with the Coca-Cola lyric had already been distributed to record shops and was in the hands of consumers across Britain before Davies made his transatlantic round trip to fix a single word about a carbonated beverage. The BBC's concern had nothing to do with the song's depiction of a romantic and physical encounter that involved gender ambiguity in a way that would have been considered highly transgressive by the broadcasting standards of 1970. The corporation's standards team apparently either did not engage with the subject matter or made an institutional decision to pass over it, focusing entirely on the trademark violation as the more clearly defined and legally manageable problem. There is a historical irony in the fact that the BBC in 1970 accepted without objection a song about a man falling for a transgender woman while requiring a transatlantic round trip to fix a reference to a soft drink. The song reached number 2 in the United Kingdom and number 9 in the United States, and it became a staple of classic rock radio programming for decades. The version that virtually all listeners around the world know and associate with the Kinks is the re-recorded one that Davies created specifically to satisfy a BBC regulation, not the one that was originally pressed and distributed, making it one of the stranger and more instructive artifacts of broadcast policy in the history of British rock music. Number 7, Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Frankie Goes to Hollywood released Relax in November 1983, and BBC Radio 1 disc jockey Mike Reed refused to play it during his program in January 1984, announcing on air that he found its content obscene and would not broadcast it. BBC management responded by implementing a full ban across all BBC radio and television output, and crucially, they announced the ban publicly rather than simply removing the record from playlists without comment. The effect of the public announcement was immediate and commercially dramatic. The record shot to number 1 on the UK singles chart and remained there for 5 consecutive weeks, spending 42 weeks on the chart in total before the run was finally finished. The song and every element of the promotional campaign surrounding it had been built around deliberate sexual provocation. The band and their label, ZTT Records, run by producer Trevor Horn, who had become one of the most commercially sophisticated figures in the British music industry, had constructed an entire strategy around the likelihood of controversy and had designed the artwork, the marketing materials, and the record itself to generate maximum reaction. The BBC's very public ban delivered that reaction at a scale that exceeded what even the most optimistic planning could have anticipated. Mike Read acknowledged in later interviews that his public refusal to play the record had contributed directly to its commercial success, rather than suppressing it in any meaningful way. The controversy around Relax was still generating newspaper coverage when the band released their second single, Two Tribes, which debuted at number 1 and extended a commercial run that might have been considerably more modest without the BBC's intervention. The Relax ban stands as perhaps the single most counterproductive act of music censorship in British broadcasting history, converting a dance record with a strong following into a national conversation and a defining cultural moment of the decade. Number 6, Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, by Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd released Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2 in 1979, and it reached number 1 in the United Kingdom and the United States, becoming one of the most commercially successful singles the band ever released, despite their primary identity as an album act who had rarely concerned themselves with the singles market during the preceding decade. The song was banned in South Africa following its release, after black schoolchildren and young people in that country began using it as an anthem during protests against the government's apartheid-era educational policies. Students sang it at demonstrations, played it in solidarity gatherings, and adopted its central imagery of institutional control, regimentation, and the crushing of individual thought as a direct and resonant expression of their experience under the Bantu Education Act and the broader apartheid system that governed every aspect of their lives. The South African government's response was to instruct broadcasters to remove the song from airplay immediately and completely. The ban had no effect on the record's commercial performance anywhere else in the world, where it was received as a classic rock album track and an arresting moment of mainstream success for a band known for more challenging work. But the South African government's decision to actively suppress it said something significant about the song's communicative power. That music conceived from one cultural perspective, about conformity, institutional authority, and the damage done by systems of control, could travel across an ocean and speak with immediate, urgent relevance to people experiencing a form of oppression that Roger Waters, who wrote the lyrics, had not specifically imagined when he composed them. The South African broadcast band confirmed that the apartheid government understood the song to be genuinely dangerous rather than merely commercially successful entertainment, which is the most serious classification a government can apply to a popular record, and which Pink Floyd could not have anticipated when they were recording it at Britannia Rose Studios. Number 5. My Ding-a-Ling by Chuck Berry.
Catch me playing with my ding-a-ling-a-ling-o.
Chuck Berry released My Ding-a-Ling in 1972 as a live recording captured during a concert in Coventry, England, and it became his only #1 single on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching the top chart position simultaneously in the United States and the United Kingdom. For a performer who had written and recorded some of the most essential and foundational songs in the entire history of rock and roll, Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven, Rock and Roll Music, Maybelline, Sweet Little 16, achieving the commercial peak of his career with a deliberately juvenile double entendre novelty song built around a child's word for a bell was an outcome that Berry himself regarded with wry amusement rather than professional pride. The BBC moved against the record almost immediately after it appeared on Top of the Pops and began to chart, following an organized campaign by Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association, the pressure group she had been operating since the 1960s, in her sustained effort to remove what she identified as indecency and moral corruption from British broadcasting. Whitehouse's organization mobilized its membership to send complaint letters to the BBC in volume following the song's television appearance, and the BBC's management responded by removing the record from broadcast rotation. The complaint rested on the reading, which Berry's performance style and the audience participation element of the live recording made essentially impossible to dispute. That the song's lyrics, structured around a child's innocent word for a toy, were functioning as a sustained and deliberate metaphor for male anatomy. Berry, who had spent the 1950s watching his recordings face systematic resistance on American radio that was motivated primarily by racial prejudice, rather than any genuine concern about content, and who had served prison sentences during that period under circumstances that many observers have characterized as racially motivated prosecution, found the White House campaign and the BBC's response to it both predictable and darkly appropriate. He had encountered a music industry that had taken his creative work, profited from its influence on a generation of white performers, and treated him as a secondary figure in the story of a genre he had helped create. To finally reach the commercial summit with a novelty record and then have the BBC pull it at the request of a pressure group was, in his account of the situation, simply another chapter in a story whose shape he had long since learned to recognize. My Ding-a-Ling remains the record that gave him his largest commercial moment, even as every serious critical assessment of his contribution to music rests on recordings made a decade and a half before it.
Catch me playing with my ding-a-ling-a-ling-o.
Number 4, Ohio, by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Neil Young wrote Ohio in direct response to the killing of 4 students by National Guard troops at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young recorded the song within days of the shootings, and Atlantic Records released it as a commercial single within weeks of the session. One of the fastest turnarounds from real-world event to finished, commercially distributed pop single in the history of American popular music. Several radio stations refused to broadcast it when it arrived, and a number of markets across the Midwest, including stations operating within Ohio itself, declined to add it to playlists or quietly removed it after initial additions. The song named President Nixon directly and by name and described the Kent State killings in language that some station managers and station owners considered too politically inflammatory to risk broadcasting, particularly in markets where advertisers were sensitive and local opinion on the Vietnam-era protests was divided or hostile. The resistance to Ohio on American radio was not the product of a nationally coordinated decision made by any single authority. There was no regulatory ban, no network directive, no centralized instruction. Instead, individual programmers and station owners in markets across the country made their own calculations about their local audience's political temperature, their major advertisers' tolerance for controversy, and their own personal and institutional alignments. And a significant number of them concluded that broadcasting a song in which a former member of the counterculture accused the sitting president of causing the deaths of American students was a risk they were unwilling to accept. In markets where it was played without restriction, it received strong airplay and generated the kind of listener engagement that made it one of the most discussed and argued about political recordings of that turbulent year. Young has spoken in multiple interviews across the decades since about the urgency and necessity of the response, that writing and recording and releasing the song as immediately as the logistics of the music industry allowed felt like the only morally coherent option, and that a more deliberate or commercially managed release schedule would itself have been a form of complicity with the silence he was trying to break. The record reached number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100, despite the uneven and geographically inconsistent airplay, and it has remained one of the most anthologized, discussed, and cited political documents in the entire history of American popular music. Number 3, Glad to Be Gay by Tom Robinson Band.
Sing if you're glad to be gay.
Tom Robinson Band released Glad to Be Gay in 1978, and the BBC banned it from all broadcast immediately. The song was a direct, unambiguous, and lyrically detailed account of the treatment of gay men in Britain, including police harassment, violence in the streets, media stereotyping, and the hypocrisy of establishments that profited from gay customers while publicly condemning them in the same breath. Robinson performed it under his full name and with no ambiguity whatsoever about its subject matter or his own identity, at a moment when homosexuality had been legal in England and Wales for only 11 years, and when the cultural climate around gay identity remained deeply hostile across mainstream public life, including at the BBC itself.
Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing.
The BBC's ban on Glad to Be Gay was total and sustained, extending well beyond the song's initial period of release. It was not played on BBC Radio 1 at any point during the 1970s. The song appeared on Tom Robinson's debut album, Power in the Darkness, in 1978, which reached number 4 on the UK albums chart despite receiving essentially no radio support, meaning the song was commercially available and sitting in the record collections of tens of thousands of households across Britain, while remaining entirely absent from mainstream broadcast. Robinson performed it live extensively and with enormous energy, including at political benefit concerts and Rock Against Racism events, where it consistently received a response from audiences that contrasted sharply with the silence maintained by the broadcasting establishment. The BBC's suppression of the song made it one of the most significant underground recordings of the late 1970s, British punk and new wave period, a record that politically engaged young people specifically sought out because they understood it was something the establishment had made a deliberate and institutional decision to keep off the airwaves.
Sing if you're glad to be gay.
Number 2, The Wall by Pink Floyd.
You don't need no education.
Pink Floyd's The Wall was released as a double album in November of 1979, and while the album itself was not the subject of a formal ban, several of its individual tracks faced significant airplay resistance at American radio stations during the early 1980s as the band continued releasing material from it and the record's cultural footprint continued expanding. Comfortably Numb, Hey You, and Run Like Hell all encountered individual programming resistance at stations that found the album's conceptual darkness, its sustained exploration of psychological breakdown, isolation, childhood trauma, and the disintegration of a public persona, difficult to reconcile with commercial radio's strong preference for emotionally accessible and advertiser-friendly material. The Alan Parker film adaptation, released in 1982 and featuring animated sequences directed by Gerald Scarfe alongside the live-action footage, brought enormous renewed attention to the album's material, and the BBC scheduled the film in a late-night restricted time slot rather than treating it as mainstream programming, citing the intensity and disturbing nature of its visual content.
All in all, it's just another bring you home.
The broader cultural suppression around the wall is harder to document comprehensively than a clear-cut formal ban, precisely because it operated largely through omission and informal avoidance rather than through any centralized or publicly stated prohibition. Stations that chose to play Comfortably Numb often played it very heavily and built loyal audience segments around it, while other stations of comparable market size in different regions simply routed their scheduling around the album entirely, treating its subject matter as incompatible with the daytime and drive time slots that generated the highest advertising rates and the largest advertiser commitments. The result was a geographic and demographic patchwork of exposure across the United States that meant some listeners grew up with The Wall as a constant radio presence during their adolescent years, while listeners in markets of similar size barely encountered it on the airwaves at all during the same period. The album sold over 30 million copies worldwide regardless of the inconsistent airplay it received, which demonstrated that the audience for music with genuine emotional and psychological complexity was substantially larger than the assumptions embedded in commercial radio programming formats had ever accounted for or tried to serve. Number 1. Radio Gaga by Queen. Queen released Radio Gaga in January 1984, and it reached number 1 in 19 countries, topping charts across the United Kingdom, Europe, and beyond, while peaking at a considerably more modest number 16 in the United States. The gap between American and international performance was not the result of a formal prohibition, but of something more systemic and far less transparent. The song was consistently underprogrammed by American FM radio stations, whose rigidly formatted commercial structures could find no obvious slot for what Queen was delivering in 1984, and whose programming directors were not inclined to make room for material that did not fit their established categories.
All we hear is Radio Gaga.
American FM rock radio in the early 1980s had become a tightly managed commercial format in which songs were selected, tested with audience panels, and assigned to rotation based on demographic and genre fit. Queen's sound by 1984 had moved substantially towards synthesizers and production values that the format categorized as neither hard rock nor pop in a way that aligned with any defined listener profile. The lyrical content, an elegy for radio's lost adventurousness and daring, a complaint that the medium had abandoned imagination in favor of safe commercial repetition, created an additional layer of awkwardness for programmers being asked to broadcast a song about radio's failures on the very medium being criticized. The circular logic of the situation, a song arguing that radio no longer played interesting music being passed over by radio programmers, was noticed and written about by music journalists, who found it too perfectly illustrative of the point being made to ignore. Freddie Mercury performed Radio Gaga at Live Aid at Wembley Stadium in July 1985, in what an enormous number of musicians, critics, and audience members have subsequently described as the greatest single live performance in the history of rock. Approximately 72,000 people were in Wembley Stadium that afternoon, and an estimated global television audience of 1.9 billion watched the broadcast. The synchronized hand clap that swept through the crowd during Radio Gaga became one of the most iconic images of the entire event, and the performance introduced the song to an audience that made the decisions of American radio programmers look like the small, cautious, format-driven choices they had always been. If you remember any of these songs from the first time around, Whether you caught them on the radio before they disappeared, found them on an import copy, or heard about them from someone who knew where to look, you know exactly what it felt like when somebody decided what you were and weren't allowed to hear. The gatekeepers of that era had real power over what reached people's ears, and the decisions they made shaped the culture in ways that are still being worked out today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.